We good? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and start, since it's a little after 9 this morning. And I got the thumbs up from Scott back there that we're good to go. And from Chris. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming today. I've been super excited to do this. I haven't taught wow. I'm on stage.
You need lighting. That's what he's trying.
I'm already sweating. I can feel it. Well, I spent all day working in the yard yesterday, and I'm sunburned right here. So I already feel it. So yeah, anyway, I'm really excited to do this. I haven't done an adult Sunday school class in a long time. So I've done a lot of kids ones. So if I talk to you guys like you're kids, forgive me.
You're forgiven.
Doing those kids Sunday school and teaching 5th grade and all that stuff for the last few years. We'll see. Well, as you've seen, this class is about Paul. I have a particular affinity for Paul, which I know a lot of people in more progressive churches don't necessarily share all the time. So I'm hoping to be somewhat persuasive about Paul. You look like you had something to say. Or were you just like...
No, I'm just shrinking my glass.
Okay. I defer to Fred. He was my pastor at one time. So.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, but
Go Fred.
I quit reading a long time ago.
I know. I cleaned out your library at the church. I took most of your books.
That's okay. I hope you're enjoying it.
So, anyways, I do have an affinity for Paul, and I want to be somewhat persuasive over the course of these next few classes, but I'm also not intending this as me trying to convert you to the gospel of Paul or anything. So, and to that end, where I want to start today is with questions to you. So you'll see on that first page I gave you, there's a couple questions there. I provided some space for you to take notes if you choose to, but I do have the whiteboard, and we're going to start up here. So I want to start with asking, who do you say Paul is? Who is Paul to you? What do you feel about Paul? What are some words you associate with the Apostle Paul? I know, this is quite a question. Controversial. Oh, I should be doing this. Scott told me I should be doing this. Well, it's for the video.
Oh,
So,
okay.
what's your word for Paul?
Controversial.
Controversial. I think you've captured the essence of what I'm trying to do here. Controversial.
Okay, I can't spell it.
I can.
If I called,
Well, let me do the mic.
Prophet to the Gentiles?
Prophet to the Gentiles. Interesting. Interesting word, prophet, what you chose there. What were you going to say, Fred?
I was going to call Paul a chick magnet.
A chick? I'm going to turn the floor over to Fred to let him explain that, because I don't.
Well, I'm talking about all those women since Paul are drawn to Paul, not necessarily
We were saying, I was talking with Tim beforehand, at the end of Romans, Paul names 16 people in the Church of the Romans that he wanted to shout out. 9 of them are women, so he did. This idea that Paul didn't like women is one thing I hope we can dispel a little bit. What else?
I don't know whether to call him a Christian or Jewish mystic.
Christian or Jewish mystic. I like that. I'm going to put Jewish, because we're going to talk about that here pretty quick.
Yeah, the question is, he was born a Jew, did he also die a Jew?
He said, was he born a Jew, or did he also die a Jew? Anybody else have any other words about Paul? Maybe not.
It's like an example of conversion. He is a story. He's just an example of conversion.
Yeah, he's a convert.
Right.
You put that, yeah. Yeah, the conversion story. Yeah. So some of the words I think of when I used to associate Paul with, when I had a less positive image of Paul. Difficult to read, difficult to understand. I'm trying to think of a good word for it. Very loquacious. He wrote more of the Bible. As a single person, he wrote more of the Bible than any other person in the New Testament. So I think these are some good words. I like that. I'm glad that controversial is the first word that came up for this. Because I think that's...
Question.
Uh-huh.
Do you think he wrote more than anybody else, or more of his writing was published?
That's a good question. I'm going to defer that question because we'll talk about that here shortly. We'll talk about what he did and didn't write. I'm assuming you're asking, like, when you ask that, you're saying like other people wrote a lot of things that didn't make it into the Bible? Yeah, maybe so. I mean, just in terms of what we have.
But for sure, whoever wrote Luke Acts would be right there with him, depending on what letters you accept. So
Yeah.
In terms of word count, it might be a close race.
Yeah. Luke Acts is pretty long, but that's pretty close. That's a good point. So, but I think if we'll talk more about what Paul did and didn't write at the end of our time here today, and maybe kind of get an idea of what all was in him. So, I think one thing is clear. Paul brings up a lot of emotion, a lot of strong emotions for a lot of people. There was a Facebook post going around, I don't know, probably in December. You may have seen it. That was about Paul. It was a really long one that somebody wrote. I think you shared it at one point, Fred. That's I seem to remember. And I engaged with it, and it captured, I think, the feeling that people have towards Paul pretty well. That he imposed something upon this Jesus movement that was foreign to what Jesus did, that was different than what Jesus did. You'll see the word sometimes thrown around called Paulianity, that there was Christianity and then Paul morphed Christianity or this Christian movement into something completely different. And that since Paul, the church has been grappling with Paul more than it's been grappling with Jesus. And so there's this tendency, especially I think, again, among more progressive churches, to try and get back beyond Paul, to go back before Paul wrote all those letters and recapture what it was Jesus was doing and saying, and what his earliest disciples, the people that spent time with him, were doing and saying. My central contention, and we'll get to more of this in a minute, is that we can't really do that. That is disentangling Paul from what we know of Jesus and what we know of the Christian movement is almost an impossible task. And it's also something I don't think that we should do necessarily. But we'll get to more of that. So I want to talk about my story with Paul a little bit, just to give you a glimpse of why I'm doing this, and it kind of points us towards some of my first points. So I used to be very critical of Paul. When I first was starting to do the church thing and thinking about going to seminary way back, this was like 2014, 2015, had a pretty negative view of Paul. I've always been a writer, and I started a blog in 2014 that still goes strong to this day. And one of the first things I did on that blog was this project called 30 Days of Paul. It was put on by the West Star Institute, who did the Jesus Seminar. And basically it was 30 days. We were taking the letters of Paul and reading them and writing about them each day. And we read through them in what the West Star Institute sees as chronological order. They lay it out in their book, which has the same picture on it. So we were reading and writing about 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and Romans. And so I did this project because I was critical of Paul at the time, and because I didn't feel like I understood him very well. And over the course of doing that, over the course of those 30 days, I started to really see Paul in a different way and appreciate him in a different way. I wouldn't say I necessarily came out of those 30 days feeling very positive about Paul, but I was much more interested in who he was and in these writings, and I was ready to grapple with them. That was 2015. I have been grappling with Paul since then, especially with the book of Romans, which I have a very love-hate relationship with, because it's a very difficult book. But I've come to find Paul to be a very profound voice for inclusion in the church, for a universal gospel as opposed to a more closed-off gospel. To have as somebody who loves theology, somebody who has a really profound and deep theology. The stuff he wrote is really intense. And also just reading the letters that scholars feel pretty certain were Paul's, the 7 letters that were Paul's. He's a really beautiful writer. He's an amazing writer. He had quite a way with words. maybe I imagine it because I've bought the argument of the 7 authentic letters of Paul, but I feel like when I shift from reading Romans, which we definitely know Paul wrote, to reading something like Ephesians, which maybe Paul didn't write, or Titus, which Paul definitely didn't write, there's a definite shift in the way that you read it, in the way the language sounds, and just in the literary nature of it. Most of all, what I came out of 30 Days of Paul feeling, and what I have felt since then, is that Paul cannot be ignored. We cannot set him aside and say we're going to go back to just Jesus and just do the words of Jesus. Paul had too much of an impact on how we understand Jesus, too much of an impact on the way the church was built, and still impacts in a really large way the way that we encounter Christianity. There's no escaping Paul. Just like I believe there's no escaping Augustine, there's no escaping Thomas Aquinas. He's one of those people that we can't get away from. And speaking of people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Paul was a huge impact on the writings of these guys. So I know you guys talked about Augustine with Dr. Bessler. Augustine's conversion experience was a reading of the book of Romans. He loved Paul. Luther was the same way. Martin Luther spent a lot of time grappling with Romans, justification by faith, faith not works, those kinds of things. John Wesley, I'm a former Methodist, so John Wesley carries a lot of weight with me. His conversion, or his Aldersgate experience, was because he was reading Romans. And he had this big revelation. His heart was strangely warmed, as he wrote. Bonhoeffer, who I also love, was a big reader of Paul and really grappled with the cruciform nature of discipleship in his works. So Karl Barth, another one that I really like, that me and Dr. Bessler go back and forth on, because Dr. Bessler doesn't like Karl Barth. Karl Barth wrote a commentary called the Epistle of the Romans that was probably the most important work of theology in the 20th century. So he's really important. I don't think I need to say any more trying to convince that. He's also really controversial. He's really difficult to read. So I hope that over the course of these 4 weeks that we come to understand who Paul is better, what he wrote. We'll only be able to take a small stab at that because there's so much of it and it's so deep. And when Chris first asked me, when I told him I wanted to teach this class, and he said, how many weeks will you want to do? And I said, I could do 52 weeks. We could do the whole year. Like, I could talk about Paul for just endless ages. So we will very briefly touch on some of Paul's theology, and I've got some important points I think we'll pull out. And then hopefully the third thing that we'll do is try and reappropriate some of that theology that we'll go through and some of the important concepts in Paul to re-understand how we think about Paul's approach to things like women's role in the church, his words on homosexuality and sexuality in general, his words about worldly authorities and slavery and all those things. So that's kind of a broad overview. One important programming note, I'll teach this week, next week. On the 21st, Pete Enns, who's going to be here for a special talk, we'll do Sunday school that morning. He's going to talk about Paul too. I don't know what he's going to talk about. He may come in and argue against Paul, I don't know. So, but he's going to do that week, and then I'll come back at the end of the month. Are there any questions about any of that? I feel like I've thrown a lot of information at you very quickly. It's just going to get worse from here. So, let's talk about Paul's biography real quick. On the sheet that I gave you on the handout is a rough timeline of Paul's life. That timeline is drawn verbatim from this book. This book is really good, Apostle of the Crucified Lord. Michael Gorman, he is a scholar of the New Testament at St. Mary's Seminary. This is basically a textbook, but he has done a really good job of going through Paul's letters one by one and reconstructing a little bit of what we know of Paul's life. And what you find is that really, we don't know much about Paul at all in terms of biographical detail. What do we know? We know his name, Saul, which is a Jewish name. You think about King Saul in the Old Testament. We often hear this story that he had this conversion experience and then he became Paul. Not really. There's not really like scriptural evidence for that. Paulos was just the Greek version of the name Saul. The book of Acts refers to him as Saul at his conversion experience, refers to him as Saul for like 2 more chapters, and then just randomly starts calling him Paul with no explanation. So it's the same name, really. We know that Paul was from Tarsus, which is on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, called Anatolia at the time. So it was a very large city. It would have been a big hub for trade. A lot of ships would have stopped there on the route between Rome on their way to Alexandria or to the Middle East. We know because he was born in Tarsus, he was a Roman citizen, so he had rights under Roman law. That would have been pretty exceptional for the people who were early Christians. We also know, to go back to Tim's point, he was a Jew. More specifically, he was a Pharisee. He tells us that in Galatians, that he was a Pharisee. The Pharisees, if you know your Gospels, are mentioned quite a bit. Pharisees were a sect of Judaism. So if the Sadducees were the other big sect, they were the ones who ran the temple. The Pharisees were kind of like the outside party, standing in conflict with the Pharisees. Pharisees believed in two big main things. They believed in an afterlife, whereas a lot of Jews didn't. So they had a very apocalyptic worldview. Books like Daniel would have been very important to them. So they believed that. Let me find my notes on this. Oh, they're right here. So they believed in an afterlife. They also, an important part of being a Pharisee was that they believed that in order to worship in the temple, that you had to go through ritual purification. And they did that through full body immersion in water. So if you go to Jerusalem now, in archaeology have uncovered these big vats that they believe were filled with water that were used by the Pharisees to completely immerse themselves in water. They'd go through these purification rituals that they drew from the book of Leviticus, and then they were able to go into the temple and worship God. That was in very stark contrast to the Sadducees and to a lot of Jews who did not think you had to go through that level of ritual purification. Those things are important to understanding who Paul was and understanding how he then thought about Jesus. So understanding that he believed in this ritual purification and that he believed in an afterlife shaped how he approached the words of Jesus. We know that he did work as a tent maker. It doesn't necessarily mean that his family was a family of tent makers. There's some scholarly speculation that that's something he took on as an adult. He's very adamant in his letters that he is not the kind of disciple or apostle that's going to come to these churches and have them pay for him. He's very adamant that he's going to come support himself. He'll provide for his own financial needs working as a tent maker so that he doesn't place any burden on the churches. A lot of the traveling preachers at the time, people like Apollos, which Paul mentions in his letters, would have been supported by the churches. And in fact, some churches, Corinthians, for instance, 2 Corinthians goes into this, view it as a mark of honor that they got to financially support these apostles. And so it was scandalous that he didn't allow them to do this. He would have been fluent in Aramaic and Greek, definitely by speech. More than likely he could speak Hebrew. He could definitely read in Hebrew because he was trained as a temple priest. So he could definitely read the scroll of the Torah. We do know that the works that he did, so he traveled, he planted some churches, and he wrote letters. All right, that's a broad outline of what he did. What he did on a more specific basis, the stuff like we read necessarily in Acts, we really don't have any other scholarly backup other than taking the words of the author of Acts at face value. We also know that he was a later convert to the faith. So if we think about his biography and the biography that's on the page there, he first converted about 3 years after Jesus would have been crucified, somewhere in the 3 to 6 year range here. A lot of scholars place Jesus' death in about the year 33. At that time, Paul would have been persecuting early Jewish Christian converts, traveling around. So he was first converted 3 years after that. But then, the earliest letter we have from him was more than likely written in the year 50. So we have almost 20 years between the time when Paul went through his call or his conversion experience to when he started writing letters that we have in our possession today. And in fact, he says in Galatians, which is the text, or no, I haven't given you that text. He says in Galatians, which is the place where he in most detail lays out his biography, that after conversion, he spent 3 years in Damascus. He doesn't say what he was doing in Damascus. He was just in Damascus for 3 years. And then he says that he spent 14 more years traveling around. He doesn't say what he was doing during those 14 years. He was just traveling around. So then we start having letters in about 50, and all of his letters fall in that decade from 50 to 60. We don't really know when he died. We're pretty sure he died in Rome. Church tradition tells us he died as a martyr for the faith. He does talk about in his letters, and Acts also tells us that he had been persecuted and accused of things in Caesarea, which is in modern day Israel. He then went to Rome as a prisoner to get his trial before the emperor, which was his right as a Roman citizen, and that at some point between the years 62 and 68, he died. Clement I, who was an early Christian writer, wrote about 30 years after the death of Paul, does state that he died in martyr. Clement is considered one of the first popes. He was in Rome, so his recollections could be pretty well relied upon, as well as somebody thinking 30 years ago of something that happened could be relied upon. We also know that he went through a whole bunch of imprisonments in his life. He was imprisoned in Rome, definitely. He was imprisoned in, I'm trying to think what some of the other cities were. He was imprisoned in Ephesus for a while. He's imprisoned in Jerusalem and Caesarea, which was also in modern day Israel. He was imprisoned in, I'm missing one, I want to say Crete, on the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. So he had a lot of imprisonments that were tied to the work that he was doing, the things he was traveling around and teaching at the time. Are there any questions about the timeline of Paul's life before I move on? I promise all of this won't be quite so me talking at you, but I think it's important to understand who Paul was or what we know about Paul. So how do we know about Paul? We have three main things that we can attribute to talk about Paul. Paul's letters, that's the most important thing. We know with pretty strong certainty that there are these 7 letters that Paul wrote. And he gives us little snippets of his life in there. He talks about his imprisonments in Galatians, especially. I keep coming back to Galatians. That's the place where he really lays out his story as such. So Paul's letters is the best place we can go to find out more about him. The book of Acts is the second place we could go. The book of Acts was not written by Paul. The book of Acts was written probably about 30 to 35 years after Paul died. Some believe that it was written by somebody who traveled with or knew Paul. Paul references a Luke in some of his letters. We don't know that with any certainty at all. And in fact, the story that we know of Paul's conversion experience is all drawn from Acts. Paul doesn't really talk about what that experience was in detail other than the reference that it happened. I would say to take the things that Acts tells us about Paul with a pretty large grain of salt. It's trying to tell a particular story about the early church. And it's trying to put that story within a particular context that the writer of Luke wanted to do. The person who wrote Acts also wrote the book of Luke. So if we're going to talk about what we know about Paul, if we can't also verify that through his letters, then anything that Acts says about Paul, we're going to say, we don't know. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. The third thing I put up here is letters attributed to Paul. So there's a lot more letters in the New Testament besides those 7 that I named that have Paul's name on them. Colossians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus. Some people even want to attribute things like Hebrews to Paul, which is a little wild. We'll talk about here in a minute how likely it is Paul wrote some of those other letters. I don't necessarily think it is very likely, but what is likely is that the people who wrote letters like Colossians and Ephesians and Timothy and Titus knew Paul or were affiliated with this movement of people who were around Paul and who were traveling and preaching at the time. And so they can tell us a little bit about not necessarily what Paul did during his life, but some of the things that Paul believed, and specifically how his words and the things that he taught had an effect on the things that people were doing at the time as Christians. So I think there's a little bit to be drawn there. All right, so Paul's letters. This is what I really wanted to get into, because this is one of the big things that really had a big impact on me on how I think about who Paul was. So, Paul's letters. A lot of scholars, including the Westar Institute here, including Michael Gorman here, have 7 authentic letters of Paul. I've listed them here: 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and Romans. Those are in what the Westar Institute believes to be chronological order, and those are the letters that we can say with a pretty strong certainty Paul did write himself. Then you have some letters that are disputed letters, but that I think, if we're going to shade over into could Paul have written other things, these are the ones I think are more likely, in order of likeliness. 2 Thessalonians, which sounds a lot like Paul, but has some theology that doesn't necessarily match up with the other things that he's written. Colossians sounds a little less like Paul, but is very Pauline in its theology. And Ephesians, which I think sounds very different from Paul's voice, but which also operates as a really good umbrella encapsulation of the things that Paul believed. Gorman believes that Ephesians was written by one of Paul's closest followers at Paul's direction. That Paul said, hey, I need you to send a letter. Ephesians is believed to be like a circulatory letter that would have gone to a lot of different churches, not necessarily just to the church at Ephesus. So Paul said, I need you to write a letter encapsulating everything that I believe to send out to the churches, and that this person sat down and wrote this letter at Paul's direction. And maybe even Paul went back and edited it. Then you get to the disputed and unlikely. 2 Timothy, 1 Timothy, and Titus, they all carry Paul's name. They all reference a lot of people that Paul references in life. If you read them, they don't sound like Paul. The theology is really different. It's a theology that's much more rooted in a church that was less transitory and much more rooted in place, that started to have a hierarchy that was more concerned with the everyday lives of people. Now, I put them down there as disputed unlikely, and I know my tendency has always been to just kind of dismiss those letters and to never read them. I've definitely come to a place where I don't want to do that anymore. I do think that those letters were probably written by somebody also affiliated with Paul's movement, maybe after Paul's death, so not at his direction, but somebody who was trying to carry on Paul's legacy. One point that Gorman makes that was really convincing for me is that in the book of 2 Timothy, the author of 2 Timothy is really concerned with defining what is truth, and to commending to the person reading 2 Timothy that speaking in the truth, being truthful, was really important. And so Gorman says, if this author thinks that truth is so important, and he writing it, he probably knew the people he was writing to, is he then going to lie about who he was in such a bold-faced way if he wants to convince them of the truth? Attributing Paul's name to his letter would not have been a lie. It would have been a well-worn tradition of the early church to say that this letter was affiliated with this person or that person. But to try and trick his readers into thinking that he was Paul in an untruthful way really stands against what the author of 2 Timothy is trying to do in their larger project. So I definitely don't think Paul wrote those letters. I don't want to dismiss them totally. We're not going to get into them in terms of the theology that they have for understanding Paul's theology, because I don't think it's really relevant. But one of my personal tasks over the coming months is to engage those texts a little bit more and understand them. Yes?
Why do you have an asterisk by
Wow, it's almost like I set you up for that. That's amazing. There is an asterisk by 2 Corinthians, because 2 Corinthians is the one letter. So the rest of these letters, we feel pretty sure are the text as Paul wrote them. The only one that maybe has some same questions as 2 Corinthians is Philippians. 2 Corinthians, scholars are pretty sure, is not one consistent letter. That it is, in fact, 3 or 4 other letters that have been stitched together after the fact into one piece. So if we think about everything we have that Paul wrote to Corinthians, we have probably 4 to 5 letters that Paul wrote to Corinthians. And if you read them chronologically, so I've got the chronological order here on the next slide. If you read 1 Corinthians and then read these in order, you see this development of the things that are going on with the church in Corinthians. It's really interesting. So 2 Corinthians, this isn't super relevant, but I wanted to make sure I got this point across. 2 Corinthians, scholars say, is 3 or 4 different letters. This is the breakdown as this book gives it to us. That the first letter is found in chapter 2, verses 14 through 6, chapter 2, verses 14 through chapter 6, verse 13, and then also a small part of chapter 7. This is one letter. They call it a defense of Paul's credibility. Paul is trying to defend himself against some other teachers that have come into the church at Corinth and tried to cast doubt on his fitness as a teacher. This goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago about Paul not taking payment from the church. That was one of the big talking points they had against him, is he's not letting you do him honor by taking care of him. He comes in and works. What kind of person works outside of being a teacher of the gospel. So Paul is defending himself in this letter. Then we have letter 2, chapters 10 through 13, one stronghold. Chapters 10 through 13 are a really powerful whirlwind of theology. It's called a parody of a fool's speech. So Paul is basically putting together this Socratic dialogue, which is something Paul likes to do quite a bit, where he has one person talking, that he's talking for one person, and then he's rebutting that person's speech. All right, so this letter, scholars believe, came after this one. So Paul writes his first defense of credibility. Then whoever those false teachers were say more against Paul. And so Paul feels like he needs to write a second letter attacking those teachers. One thing Paul definitely was shy of going after somebody. He didn't have any problem saying what he thinks. If you read Galatians, again, I keep coming back to Galatians. Galatians is scathing. He doesn't even, like, all of his letters, he starts off with this nice prayer, like, oh, I'm so glad to be writing to you. God send blessings on you through Jesus and the Spirit. Galatians, none of that. He just launches right in and calls them fools and stupid in the first 3 verses of the letter. It's amazing. All right, letter 3. So we have a letter of reconciliation. This is the beginning of the letter, so the very start of the letter through chapter 2, and then coming back to chapter 7 again, where he's trying to draw the church of Corinth back to him after this dispute they've been going through. And then the letter 4 would be chapters 8 through 9, and a collections appeal. A big part of what Paul was doing was going to these churches and preaching the gospel, but also having them chip in some money that he was going to send back to Jerusalem to Peter and James in the first church. We're going to get into why he was doing that here in a second, but chapters 8 and 9 are just a collections appeal. He's writing them saying, hey, you guys committed to sending this amount of money for me to take to Jerusalem. I need you to do that. I need you to follow through on that. So thank you for asking that, because I think I would have forgot to go back to that. Yeah.
So, with the 2 Corinthians, the whole Corinthian correspondence could have been like 4 or 5 letters. It suggests that some editing was done, and I think there's some scholars have a theory that maybe Ephesians was written, like you said, as a letter, and they compiled some of the writings of Paul, and that was kind of the preface to the writings of Paul.
Yeah.
Does Westar scholars say anything about that? Or is that
About Ephesians being that preface, or?
I mean, a preface, and then there were these other letters of Paul that went along with it. That
Yeah.
are circulated among the churches.
I don't remember if Westar specifically says that. I've read that theory that Ephesians was kind of like this preface, and then all of Paul's letters would come with Ephesians. I think that's a good way to look at Ephesians. Ephesians really has this quality of it as being kind of this summary of theology, written by somebody else. So, but I don't remember if Westar specifically posits that. They really focus in this book on those 7 letters and kind of going through what they're about. Okay, so what was Paul's mission? He's going around, he's going to all these churches, some that he planted, some that he didn't. He's writing all these letters, tons of letters, so many letters. What was he doing? Gorman, I think, has a really good breakdown of what Paul was doing. He's got this really long, wordy, jargon-filled statement here. To create a vast network of multicultural faith communities obeying and glorifying the one true God of Israel by living lives of faith, hope, and love in Christ Jesus, the Lord, by the power of the Spirit. Whew, there's a lot going on there. I think Gorman's right about all that. We're going to get into that more next week when we talk about Paul's theology. But in Paul's own words, I always come back to this statement that he makes in Galatians. He said, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's what he's going and doing. He has had this experience, whatever this experience was in Damascus, whether it was a conversion, whether it was a call, which is more what I think it was, a calling that he experienced on his life. In this experience, he went from being a Pharisaic Jew who was opposed to the church to being still a Jewish man, very rooted in his Jewishness, in those things that he had been brought up in that had defined his whole life to that point. But he had experienced something around this man Jesus, and the words that he said and the actions that he did, and especially for Paul, the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus is so important. Next week, when we talk about theology, we're going to talk about his theology through the frame of a bunch of words that are really important to Paul. And I think the most important word for understanding Paul is cruciform. Everything for Paul was seen to be cross-shaped. Everything about being a disciple was cross-shaped. And so when Paul says, I decided, when he says to this church at Galatians, when I came to you and I came to preach to you, I wanted to preach nothing to you except for Jesus Christ and the fact that he was crucified. Everything else falls under that umbrella. Everything else is built upon that. All right. I added a second note here because I think it's important too to point out, which we did here, that he said, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. It was really important to understand that Paul had a very specific audience in mind. He was a Jew. He talked to a lot of Jewish people, but he felt his mission was to go talk to people who were not Jewish specifically. And that's what we're going to end with today, is thinking about why Paul was talking to Galatians and what this means for understanding who Paul was. This is crucial for me, for my turn from being much more skeptical of Paul to being much more accepting of Paul, was getting my mind around what his mission was. So, Paul's conflict with Peter and James. I've given you a text, on the second page is the text from Galatians, the first and second chapter of Galatians. This is the longest stretch of text we have in Paul's letters where he is speaking biographically. He is telling his story to the Galatians here of how he came to be an apostle and what he was trying to do. If you remember, we said a minute ago, Galatians is the letter where he's angry. He's writing to this church at Galatia because he spent a lot of time there. He's planted this church. Galatia would have been in central Turkey today, this mountainous region. He had planted this church there. It was a largely Gentile church. And then after he planted this church and left, some other teachers came in and start telling the people of Galatia that in order to be Christians, they need to first be Jews. If they want to be followers of Jesus, they must be circumcised. They must start following the law. They must observe the Torah, observe all the Jewish festivals, those things. So Paul is writing back to the Galatians saying, no. That's not what I taught you. You don't have to do any of that stuff to be a Christian. So that's what he's writing here in this letter. And part of what he's doing at the beginning of this letter is establishing his bona fides as an apostle. Because these other teachers came in and said, who is this guy? We know that Paul was persecuting Christians just a few years ago. He was killing you all. And now he's coming here and he's undermining Judaism and telling you don't have to be a Jew. And so he's putting your salvation in doubt, basically, is what they're telling him. And Paul's saying, no. You don't have to do all that stuff. And here's why. Here's why I was talking to you. Here's what's important about my story. Here are my resume, in essence. So I want to go through this. I want to go through this text a little bit, not line by line quite, but I think it's really important for understanding his conflict with Peter and James, which we'll come back to. So we know he says in verse 15 there that he was called by God, not converted. So his Jewishness is really key. He is a Jew. All right. He was a very observant Jew. We talked about being a Pharisee. He believed that he needed to be immersed in water every time he was going to go worship God at the temple. So he writes in there too that he was zealous for the faith. He had a lot of zeal. He says in there in his biography in verses 18 and 19 that after he went through this call, he spent 3 years in Damascus. And then the first thing he does after that is he goes to Jerusalem and he meets with Peter and James. Now, who are Peter and James? We've heard a lot about Peter over the course of Lent. Peter was Jesus' closest follower. He, after Jesus died, was kind of the center of the church in Jerusalem. I think Peter's also a very fascinating figure because he's kind of the guy that, Jesus died, and then, we can debate the resurrection or whatever, but the fact of the matter is that Jesus died and wasn't there anymore to hold this movement together, and somebody had to hold it together, and Peter's the guy who did that, and that shows a lot of character. So Paul goes to Jerusalem to meet with Peter. James is believed to be the brother of Jesus. Also a very central figure in the church. The book of James in the Bible, which is a really good book, is attributed to him. So they were kind of the leaders of the church. And then John would have been there as well, the Apostle John, or the disciple John. Paul goes there to meet with them, to learn more about Jesus probably, and to also state his intention that he wanted to go become a teacher, a traveling teacher and a church planner. So he goes, he meets with them, they talk, and then he goes out, and this is where he tells us in verse 1 of the second chapter, then he goes out for 14 years doing something for 14 years. We don't really know what. And then after those 14 years, he comes back to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James and John again. And this is the time when he comes to them and he tells them that he has a new vision for the gospel. that no longer does he think that he needs to go and convert just Jews, people who have been circumcised, people that are within the Jewish faith, to then become followers of Jesus as Jews, to be a sect basically within Judaism. He says at this point that he's been called to go and preach to the Gentiles and to tell them they don't have to become Jews to be followers of Jesus. They can come just exactly as they are. Now, he has really strong theological basis for this that we'll get into next week. So we're into chapter 2 here. In verse 9 of chapter 2. So he goes and tells them, I want to go preach to the Gentiles, and I want to tell the Gentiles they don't have to become Jews to be followers of Jesus. Verse 9, Paul tells us that Peter, James, and John sign off on this and tell them that's fine. Over the objections of other people in the church. That's what the next 3 or 4 verses are about. All these people are objecting to this. But the leaders in the church of Jerusalem told him, no, that's fine. You can go plant churches, preach to the Gentiles, tell them they don't have to be circumcised. Peter and James and John said, we're still going to preach to Jews. And we're still going to preach that good Jews who have followed the law can become Christians as well. You're going to preach to Gentiles and tell them as they are, they can become Christians as well. Then, at the last part of that selection I've given you, verses 11 through 14, we then see that Paul tells us that later on, Peter and James backtrack on this promise. And that when next Paul meets Peter, Peter has said, I can't eat with non-Jews anymore. I can't associate with them anymore. We've gone back on this. And this is a big point of contention for Paul at this point. He's really angry at Peter and James for going back on their word here. And likely he feels that the people who have gone to Galatia and undermined his teaching were sent in some way by Peter and James to do so. So he has a lot of anger here. What's the point of all this? Reading this story, reading Paul contextually here, we see somebody who's not been sent out to reaffirm the established hierarchy of Judaism, not sent out to keep people complacent in a certain vision of faith. He has had this vision. Something happened to Paul in those 14 years where he had this realization that this story of Jesus and the words that he said and his crucifixion was bigger than that. And he wants to go preach this gospel that is more inclusive and more universal. He wants to bring in people from all walks of life. He says in multiple letters, he makes that statement that we've heard so much. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female. I think this is really important. And I think when we map our own vision of what inclusivity onto Paul looks like, then Paul looks like a reactionary. And he looks old-fashioned because he lived 2,000 years ago. When we understand who Paul was in relation to the rest of the church, when we see an early Christian movement embodied by Peter and James that had a very small vision of what Christianity was going to be. And here we have Paul standing outside that saying, no, this is something much bigger. This is something predicated on welcoming in people from all walks of life through Jesus Christ's death, which was an example of God's boundless love. In fact, a love so boundless that he was willing to sacrifice God's own son for people that were not just were Jews, but were outside of that original covenant promise. I think we start to understand Paul at this point as something a little bit bigger than somebody who was conservative, fundamentalist, stick in the mud. Now, none of that is to say that there aren't really contentious and problematic words in Paul's letters. We can't deny the first chapter of Romans, some of the household codes in Corinthians. One of the things that we'll see, and I should have made this point when we were talking about letters, some of the letters of Paul here, am I on the right one? Where we see Paul's more fundamentalist or reactionary writings around women in the church especially, that women should cover their heads and should be submissive to their husbands and should not speak, are found over here. And some of his words about whether or not to submit to earthly authority are found, yes, in 1 Corinthians, but this book makes a pretty convincing case that 1 Corinthians may have had some later stuff put into it. There are some passages in there that don't sound like the rest of the letter, and that are very jarring. So I've got a Bible at home that presents the text as just, it's like a book. It doesn't have chapter headings, it doesn't have verses, it doesn't have any of that. It's just a text. And when you read it in that way, some of 1 Corinthians becomes really jarring. It's like, wow, we took a turn there. All of a sudden, we're not in this anymore. So when we kind of put all those things together, this was the first big point for me when I first encountered Paul. Was like, wow, he was going out and doing a whole different thing than what the early church was trying to do. And all these verses that I have thought of as being really problematic and really hard to read are over on this side. We don't even know that Paul necessarily wrote those. And we'll get into those at the end of the month in my last class. We're going to take some of what we talk about next week with Paul's theology and then apply it to those verses. And even within some of the stuff that's there, we'll draw on Gorman especially here, makes a really strong case that even the things that Paul was doing in some of these household codes would have been really progressive at the time, based on what other people were doing, how other people were understanding what a family was, what authority was, what the state was. Do you have a question?
Just more observational and maybe a question. And set that whole dynamic up. So the Jerusalem church was very conservative. In fact, I believe the Pharisees, they believed so much in the law that they felt like if all the Jews followed the law, that the kingdom of God or heaven would come, heaven would happen, so that's why it was so important. So you have that, and I think on the far left would be probably the Church of Corinth that you see at the Jerusalem conference. They're the bunch of liberals that grace is so great we can do anything. We might sin, but grace be abound.
Yeah.
So it sets that kind of polarity up between that, which makes what you're saying Paul much more liberal in comparison to the other dynamics of Christianity. Well, and really it's more or less a Jewish sect at that time. And
It definitely was. I think that's going to be important to understand, is that Christianity at the time was not Christian. I mean, you guys know this. I don't have to say it, but it was not Christianity of today. It was a sect of Judaism. It was within Judaism. It was understood by Peter and John and Paul at first that they were still Jews, observant Jews, doing the things that Jews did, who also felt like this guy Jesus had reformed Jewishness in a new way. That was important. Paul, I talked about at the beginning, like Paul gets this bad rap of like laying a whole bunch of stuff on top of Jesus and Paulianity. That's a bad rap, how we think of it. It's also kind of right. He did. He said, no, what we're doing is not just Jewishness. It's something different from just being a Jew. It's a whole new thing. It's a whole new thing. So we're almost out of time. I have suggested reading. I'm not going to force you to read, but if it's on the paper, it's on the back of the page. If you'd like to do some reading in preparation for what we're going to talk about next week, there are 4 main passages here I've given you. Romans chapter 8, fantastic chapter of Paul's theology. I would suggest read a couple different translations if you get your hand on it. If you go out and just search Romans 8, the first thing that'll come up is BibleGateway.com. And they have as many, there's like, I don't even know how many dozens of translations of the Bible you can get through that website. So I use the NRSV, which is a good one. The Message is always fun to play with. Common English Bible, I know, is the one that Chris uses a lot. 1 Corinthians 13 and 15. 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter. It's beautiful, beautiful theology, but it's also really important to understanding Paul. And then chapter 15 as well. Galatians 5, 2 through 15. We're going on a little further from what I've given you. And then Philippians 2, 1 through 11. This is the Christ hymn. The whole letter of Philippians is modeled around these 11 verses where Paul is quoting an early hymn of the church. And it's really a beautiful piece of writing. But those are kind of where we'll come from next week. So next week, the plan is to tackle Paul's theology by understanding some important concepts. I talked about one, cruciformity. We'll talk about covenantal, I think is a really important word for him. We'll look at the triad, faith, hope, and love, which comes in 1 Corinthians 13 there. These are really important ways. Paul's theology is dense. There's a lot going on. Romans itself, I mean, people have been grappling with it since he wrote it 2,000 years ago. But I think if we can grab some big concepts, we can start to wrap our heads around the important points for Paul in the things that he wrote. And then after we hear from Pete on the 21st, we'll come back on the 28th and we'll take those important concepts and read them into some of the problematic verses of Paul and maybe reclaim them in a different way of thinking. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Mm-hmm.
In the words of my wife, because I'm a nerd. On the suggested reading, what order would you suggest reading them?
I don't think it matters a whole lot. If you want to read them chronologically, it would be Galatians, Corinthians, Philippians, and then Romans.
Okay, slow down.
Sorry. Galatians is probably the oldest of that. I believe Corinthians would come next. Corinthians is important. Then we have Philippians, although the text that he's quoting in this verse is probably older than any of this, but it's Paul's quotation of it. And then Romans. Romans is probably the last letter of Paul that we have, so it's the most recent thing. So,
Thank you, that's very helpful.
yeah. Or you could just read all 7 letters straight through by next week.
I just need direction, just tell me what to do.
All right, I think that's it. I hope this was somewhat informative and enlightening. And next week we'll get into the good stuff, which is theology.